28 minutes to, so we will kick off. My name is Kean. Thank you very much for joining this morning for the first of our four-part series. I lead the sustainability division here at calQrisk. I've been in the industry for just over sort of 2 years now, running this carbon accounting solution. So hopefully I'll be able to share with you today some of that sort of knowledge I've gained along the way. As I mentioned, this is the first of a four-part series designed to educate you guys on the fundamentals of carbon accounting, give you some insight and a grounding into it also. If I've done my job right, by the end of the four-part series, you will walk away feeling much more confident and comfortable with what is required to measure your business's carbon footprint and know where to go or what steps to do to take some action. At a high level, the fundamentals of carbon accounting revolve around sort of three areas: measuring, tracking, and managing your greenhouse gases. Um, those sort of three principles, if they're followed, will allow you to understand your impact and to reduce your emissions going forward and in the future. The goal for today, however, is to provide a picture of the end-to-end process required to conduct a carbon accounting audit and to give you a good grounding of everything involved. Please feel free to ask questions at any stage in the chat box there. I'll do my best to get to them. The session itself should only take about 30 or so minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. In order to, I suppose, fully understand carbon accounting, we really need to go back to its origins. And there's no better place for that than the greenhouse gas protocol. So you might be aware that there's multiple different sort of reporting frameworks out there. CSRD is one that's very sort of in vogue at the moment. It was previously TCFD, which is now finished up. But the greenhouse gas protocol is the bedrock of them all. It's effectively the Holy Bible. And it's a globally recognized framework for measuring and managing your greenhouse gases. But it is essentially the foundation for every other reporting framework out there. Whatever they ask from you guys in relation to your carbon accounting will stem from that greenhouse gas protocol. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was developed by the World Research Institute and also the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's designed to provide the standards and the tools to help both businesses, governments, and organizations calculate and report on your emissions consistently and to a universal standard. As I mentioned, it is the framework for many of the global reporting tools out there. And regardless of what framework you guys choose to report under, it will be that bedrock of it. So moving on to understanding emissions and their categories. There are multiple different emissions out there. Carbon dioxide is the sort of the most well known, being CO2, but you also have CH4, which is methane. That is the one that always comes up in conversations around farming, around agriculture and livestock. You've N2O, which is nitrous oxide, and you've HFCs, which are hydrofluorocarbons. They're typically the sort of gases that are used in refrigeration, cold storage, air conditioning, and so on. When it comes to reporting your greenhouse gas emissions or calculating them, however, everything is calculated in what is known as CO2e, so CO2 equivalent. This is a way to give everyone a standardized measurement, a consistent reporting tool and unit of measurement across their business, across the globe, and allows for that level of consistency across the board. So there's multiple different scopes in greenhouse gas accounting. So you have three scopes. Scope one is your direct emissions footprint. So this is any fossil fuels you burn in direct result of your actions or your business's activities. Typically, this would be your business's heating. It will be any vehicles that are used on a regular basis, such as a sales rep or shipping, for example, if you do that. And it's also any cold storage of air conditioning in the business also. People, I suppose, are often quite surprised to find out that if your air conditioning unit or your refrigeration units leak, which typically tends to happen more in older models, that those hydrofluorocarbons are quite toxic to the environment. Your scope 2 is indirect emissions. So that is typically comes from the electricity you purchase from the grid. So for example, all you would need is utility bills to gather that information. And then scope 3 is beyond that. So it's all other emissions in your value chain. Scope 3 tends to be the hardest to gather because it's the area you have the least control over, but it's not something we'd worry about at all from our point of view. It can be very manageable and very easy to calculate and cover it off. But we'll delve into the scopes in more detail in the next webinar in session 2. But what I would say is to think of the 3 Bs when you think of the scopes. So scope 1 is anything you burn in fossil fuels. Scope 2 is anything you buy from the grid and electricity, and then scope 3 is anything beyond that. So we're going to move on now onto the data collection and measurement. So like any sort of calculation, the calculation is only as good as the data that's used in it. How accurate the data is it sourced correctly? Is it referenced correctly? So we need to consider what sort of data we actually need. For your scope 1 that we mentioned there being your building's heat, and even for scope 2 being building's electricity, the main areas that we're going to look at would be your utility bills. They'd be your gold standard because they tell you your exact consumption levels within the business, but also something that people tend not to realize is they also give you your most accurate fuel mix. And your fuel mix basically details how much renewable energy your provider produces. So for example, it might be a 70-30 split, which means if you're consuming 100 kilowatts of electricity in your scope 2 emissions, 30% of that is actually renewably sourced. So your emissions would be even less than you consider. For the likes of your vehicles, if it's a van that's on the road every day, or if it's a sales rep, you're going to be looking at expense reports. The exact mileage is the most ideal form, but initially that tends to be something that businesses don't always have. It can be exports from fuel cards and so on like that. As I mentioned, for some organizations, just due to the nature of the way you're structured or your relationships with suppliers, accessing some of this information, especially your scope 3 information, won't be possible in the beginning, but it's not to worry. One thing that's important to note across carbon accounting as a whole is that estimates are allowed. And they're actually encouraged if it will give you a more comprehensive calculation. The only thing to note on that is it comes down to transparency. So if you do use an estimate, for example, you just call it out in your report, you call it out in your calculation that this is based on this estimate or this is based on this logic. Once you do that, you're fine. The actual calculations themselves are quite simple. It's typically your consumption or your activity levels times an emission factor. So you take your kilowatt hours times an emission factor, and that produces your carbon accounting or your carbon emissions for that section of your business. An emissions factor is simply a value that represents how much greenhouse gas is produced per unit of activity or input. And typically, you're going to look to source them from the likes of DEFRA, which is a UK government publication, the EPA in the US, and there's a couple of other bodies out there that also produce emission factors. The idea is to use the most accurate, the most up-to-date emission factor for your business and for your location. And that comes into things a bit more when you get into scope 2 and location-based emissions. But again, we'll touch on that next week. So we're going to move on to reporting and setting organizational boundaries. Apologies. So the organizational boundaries are quite simply, how is your report done? How are your calculations carried out? So there is 3 approaches, as you can see here. You have the operational control approach, you have a financial control approach, and you have the equity share approach. Most businesses will typically tend to take the operational control approach, which is measuring the emissions under your direct control. So typically your scope 1 and 2 emissions, and certain areas of scope 3 where it's something where, for example, you booked a flight to travel to a conference or something like that, and the conference was optional. So that's considered to be under your direct control, or a once-off business trip up the country where a vehicle is required to travel. So a financial control approach will typically come into things more so if there's a load of investments or if there's a loan book involved. In the case of, say, an investment or a loan book, essentially, if you give a loan for, say, 10% of the value of the car, you're responsible for 10% of those emissions. And as the value of the loan decreases as they make the repayments, your level of responsibility towards the emissions will also decrease. And then you have the equity share approach. So similar enough to the financial control approach, you take responsibility for your portion of the business's activities or of the activity in question, if that was a loan or if that's an investment in a fund and so on. So reporting and verification. This is a question that's probably become much more popular of late, partly because of CSRD, but partly because we've seen a move towards, I suppose, much more transparency and much more publication, and people are trying to find what is that sort of sweet spot in it. Traditionally, businesses will report on their carbon emissions annually. Reporting can be done in many forms, and it's typically dependent on the framework you prescribe to. One element that every framework has in common is that it will ask you to disclose your emissions by scope and by category. So if you take nothing else away from today, do take that if you're still trying to determine what framework to report under, just try follow the greenhouse gas protocol, because within that they'll ask you for your emissions by scope and category. And then what every other framework essentially does is ask for additional information about energy efficiency, motivations within the business for reduction targets and so on. So it's very easy to adjust and to alter the framework then if you follow the greenhouse gas protocol. What you're, I suppose, trying to understand with the framework that you fall into is the first step. So if you're a company in the UK, for example, SECR is one of their government frameworks, and there's a qualification criteria for that, which you will share with you after the call. Similar to the CSRD, there's a qualification criteria. If, for example, you're a public body in Ireland, the framework that you should fall under is the government framework. So typically the best advice really is to go to your regulator, as they will know what you fall under. If you're not finding any regulation, there's still something you want to do. Again, I keep harping on about it, but it's the greenhouse gas protocol. If you're looking to align yourself with CSRD, but you don't yet meet the criteria, there is a voluntary framework for that, which is slightly less onerous, but also means all of the processes will be in place for when you do become qualified for CSRD. So moving on slightly to, if you think now we've measured our emissions, we've reported, we've set a framework, most of the questions is, okay, what's next? We've measured it, we've got our number, what can we do? So once the calculation, the report is being finalized, you should start to think about your goals or your initiatives. In line with climate science, 2030, which is only 5 years away now, would be considered the short-term target, and 2050 is your long-term goal. And this is the gold standard for sort of reduction targets, and it's in line with the Science-Based Target Initiative. Now, if you're a business that's really mature in your carbon journey, you've been at it for a number of years, you can obviously, set a long-term target for 2040 or 2035. It doesn't have to be 2050. But it should be something that is realistically achievable. And it's also something that requires buy-in from all levels of the business. So if you can't get buy-in from your management or from the staff, it's going to be a very, very steep uphill battle. So that would be some of the key things when you're looking at setting targets. Your targets should, of course, only be set based off the results of your baseline emissions calculation. Ideally, what you will do is you look for emissions hotspots within your results. One that we typically find in Ireland and the UK that's quite easy and cost effective is actually switching to renewable energy. So In Ireland, for example, we lose more renewable energy every day than we produce. It's similar enough in the UK as to island nations because we don't have the infrastructure to store that energy. It has to be effectively purged from the system. When we talk about renewable energy and switching, people, I suppose, automatically think of solar power and the cost of installation, potentially having to shut down the place of work for a day. But it's actually much easier and much simpler. If you make a phone call to your supplier and say, I want to be switched over to 100% renewable, or you simply call up a supplier that is 100% renewable, you can then benefit from that without having to install solar panels, without having to change any of the current infrastructure that you have. Effectively, in Ireland, it's a centralized grid. So you might pay for 100% renewable energy. What's pumped into your door may not be renewable because it's a centralized grid, but anything you consume has been offset by producing the exact same quantity of renewable energy into the system. So what we have at this stage is you're looking at your targets, you're looking at your long term, your short term. And I've mentioned initiatives sort of twice there in this section. Your short and long term goals should really be considered the sort of mission and vision of the business, if you want. It's that sort of item that as a business you always strive towards, but you may never achieve. Your initiatives become more important because they're effectively the strategic objectives along the way that will actually determine if you're making progress towards your goals or if you have any chance of achieving them. The initiatives that we often see can often be very easy. It can be something such as a business travel policy. It can be items such as unplugging at the end of the day. People are often surprised about the amount of phantom energy, which is where, say, you have the switch on the wall off, or you still have the plug in, but you're not using a product that is consumed. It's the small things that will have a big impact, and it allows you to gather that momentum going forward. It allows you to really show the public as a whole that you're serious about it when you publicize these emissions. One thing that is quite important in carbon accounting is continuous improvement. So obviously carbon accounting is an ongoing process. When you get your first calculation done, which is known as your baseline emissions, you're going to look to improve on it. So one thing we will often find is that businesses won't measure the full three scopes in their initial year. They will measure scopes 1 and 2 and maybe select categories of scope 3. So the idea would be when you get around to doing your second year's calculation or calculating even on a consistent basis, which is better. So for example, monthly or quarterly, you look to add in more scopes, or sorry, more categories within scope 3 into that calculation. And as you do that, what you'll find is your process for data collection will improve. It'll become a regular, everyday thing within the business, which makes your life easier as the point of contact. But we'll also find that businesses will look to even update their targets. So as you continue to measure, to calculate, and to make progress, you might realize, you know what, we can actually reduce that 2050 goal down to 2040 or 2035, or we found a partner here who can improve our waste measurement processes. Let's adjust our calculations. One of the big things around that continuous improvement is the engagement of stakeholders, both internal and external. I've mentioned that sort of getting the buy-in from management is key to making progress. But the same way getting buy-in from staff is essential. If you want to conduct a good work from home and commuting calculation, you need staff to fill out the survey and to engage. One of the ways we find to get that engagement or to sort of foster it really is the publication of your reports, the publication of your sorry, 1 second there. Oh, that's no problem. The publication of your reports, the publication of any updates. So even if it's forming a green committee within the business where people who feel, I suppose, a personal motivation to do good start to lead the charge. All of this adds and builds the momentum that you guys need moving forward. So I think we might have 1 or 2 questions in here at the moment. That was the pause just there. I know that was a sort of maybe a quick 25 30-ish minute session at the moment to sort of dip the toe into the water. As we go on into the next sort of 3 weeks, we'll get down into the weeds that bit more with exactly how the calculations are done, where to gather your data, and then we'll deal with reporting and publication as well as frameworks. I'm just going to try and answer these questions here now if I can locate them. I'm not the best on the Zoom. Oh yeah, we have two. So will we be sharing the slides? Yep. So you will get access to all of these slides. We'll also share criteria for SECR qualification as well as CSRD. They're sort of the two main frameworks out there at the moment. And we'll be including notes on the voluntary standard that sort of sits just under CSRD as well. So that will come out later on this week. It'll likely be sort of Thursday before you get them. And then we have a question here about accusations of greenwashing when reporting. We thought we had the right information, but let's say maybe we thought the carbon emissions were lower than they were in some area. Yeah. So the greenwashing is, I suppose, it's a topic or it's something that won't go away. A lot of it comes back to that transparency. Sort of if you keep that as your guiding principle. So in this example, if you thought the carbon emissions were lower than they were in some area, you would restate your emissions in an ideal world, and you would state why, say, the incident happened or why you thought they were lower. It's more common than you think, say, to restate your emissions. So if you look at DEFRA, even for example, they will release the latest emissions sort of every year. It's typically around February time. But if you've been calculating your emissions up to that point and all of a sudden, they've restated the emissions and you see a drop, you might actually have a benefit, or it could be a case that your emissions should have been higher. All it is then is you update your emissions. You don't have to go back and update the 2023 report. But what you would do is when you get to, say, the 2024 report, you would stipulate that our emissions are actually higher than we were. So our progress isn't as good as we thought. Once you call it out, you're fine, and give a slight explanation. It's if you look to sort of hide it away or sweep it under the carpet is where you get into a bit of difficulty. Does travel to work emissions count within business scope? And if so, which scope? Yeah, so travel to work would be considered under commuting. So that would be scope 3 emissions. The same way, effectively, the business is responsible for those commuting emissions. The sort of reverse is true, that if an employee is working from home and they have renewable power, the business actually gets that sort of benefit of the employee having renewable power. One thing we often find, I suppose, is that businesses are kind of quite surprised with how easy it can be to measure the commuting emissions and how easy it can be to measure work from home emissions. So you can actually issue a survey, email it out to your staff. It's about 10 questions long. And within that, you can calculate work from home emissions down to the hour, including any air conditioning, any heating and renewable energy used. And then you can calculate the commute within a couple of kilometers based off whether it's an e-vehicle, whether they walk, get the bus, whatever mode of transport they use. So how is the risk of duplication managed between different businesses? This is actually a great question, and it's something that comes up quite a lot. Ultimately, the risk of duplication is actually encouraged, would you believe? So what I mean by that is anyone's scope 3 emissions is someone else's scope 1 or 2 emissions. So if you're a shipping company, say DPD, their scope 1 emissions, their scope 2 emissions, a lot of it's going to be the fuel that goes into the vehicles that make the delivery to your door or to your warehouse on a regular basis. Although it's their scope 1 and 2 emissions, it becomes your scope 3 emissions as shipping under scope 3, sorry. So until we get to a stage where as a society or as a world, really, everyone is measuring their own scope 1 and 2 emissions, there will always be duplication across businesses, especially in that scope 3 category. And it's the sort of practice that's actually encouraged to try and get sort of widespread coverage, that they'd nearly prefer the duplication than the opposite, where we're underreporting emissions as a result. If there's any more questions, more than happy to answer them. I think I've answered all 5 of those. but I'll be on here for a few more minutes anyways. Do feel free to drop off at this point. As I said, we'll send you on the slides and the criteria around CSRD, SECR, and so on. And my contact details will be in those slides as well. So if you want to reach out with anything one-to-one, privately, or any questions like that, please feel free to do so. Oh, I think I might have one more here. Oh, no, thanks. Sorry. If an organization is conform to ISO is required, sorry, is an organization conformance required if greenhouse gas verification is required by intended users? That will depend. Hopefully, you're still on here at the moment. But conformance with ISO is typically something that if a supplier has asked you to do it, or it's something you're doing yourself as a business, is slightly different. The greenhouse gas verification, I'm thinking is slightly you're looking at an audit. Typically, an audit is only required under CSRD at the moment. It's the only mandatory audit field or framework that requires an audit. But in terms of ISO itself, a greenhouse gas standard calculation is typically enough to satisfy that reporting once you can cover off the three scopes. But if I haven't answered that question sufficiently, if you'd be able to give me slightly more context, I'm more than happy to discuss it further. Yeah, work from home is also a scope 3 emission. Itself and commuting are different categories within scope 3, but you tend to collect the data for it sort of within the one survey. It just depends on the business. So the calculation itself will assume, say, most people have a laptop and a monitor working from home. If it's a case that your business, everyone has two monitors working from home, that's no problem. It's a small adjustment. And then it actually accounts for only the additional heating and light that's used as a result of a person working from home. If your baseline is currently being worked on, in terms of advice, I would really state that go with what's manageable. So ideally you'll do your scope 1 and 2 anyways. And then within scope 3, go with areas that you feel you can get full coverage on. Or areas where there's very good estimates available that you can get a very close approximation. If, for example, shipping was an incredibly difficult area to calculate, leave that out for the first year. You state within your report it's being left out, and then try and put in place a process to make that something you can include going forward. On those sort of averages, or say like using estimates, for example, getting a package delivered to your door at home, for example, is just over 2 kilos of CO2. And for example, that would be based on UPA or UPS's GRI report, which is based on however many billion of parcels they deliver each year. Whereas similarly, I can tell you that posting a letter produces about 20 odd grams of CO2. So there is really good estimates out there, but it's just a case of almost don't get out over your skis with the first calculation. The most important thing is to get it done and then to build on it really.